Hello and welcome. My name is Luther Elmore, and I am co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. The mission of these forums is to nourish the mind and spirit and to serve social justice. This church has been conducting these forums since the founding of this church in 1954, and as far as we know, it is the longest continuously operating public affairs forum in the state of Texas. We hold these forums on Sundays at noon, and they're free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. Our church is located at 4700 Grover Avenue in North Central Austin. For additional information, you can visit our church's website at www.austinuu.org. Today, we're very happy to have with us Dr. David Edwards. And to introduce Dr. Edwards, we have one of our fine forum committee members, Bonnie Edwards. Bonnie Gardner, excuse me, Bonnie.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see familiar faces and new faces. It's my honor today and pleasure to introduce Dr. David Edwards. What better way to commemorate 9/11 than to address issues of world peace? Dr. David Edwards is a professor emeritus in the government department at UT, and he's going to talk about his ideas for creating a more peaceful world. And he spent over 50 years of research and teaching and publishing on public policy and national and international politics. U.S. and Russian relations have been an area of specialization, very timely, and he's also taught a course on the Vietnam War experience for many, many years. Studying world peace has been a lifelong passion for him, needless to say. He earned a BA from Swarthmore College and a PhD from Harvard. At UT, he taught conflict resolution, peace studies, security policy, among other topics. He has several books: Creating a New World Politics, Arms Control and International Politics, The American Political Experience, and Practicing American Politics. He's held Rockefeller NATO research fellowships and has served as a consultant to various organizations, including the Institute for Defense Analyses, the Danforth Foundation, and the Industrial Management Center. He also does journalistic writing. He's written for the Washington Post, The Nation, and a number of other periodicals. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. David Edwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and appreciate all of you sticking around for this session. I'd like to begin by taking us back to the spring of 1963, to judge by the appearance of some of you. Some of you will remember that time. In the spring of healing from the tense 13-day standoff we call the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the United States and the Soviet Union came close to nuclear war, very close as we later learned. And the two Cold War superpowers were enmeshed in a nuclear arms race that produced heightened tensions, occasional crises, and an escalating alternation of atmospheric nuclear weapons tests that threatened the health as well as the security of the entire globe. Those tests were creating nuclear fallout around the globe that many experts concluded even made milk unsafe to drink because of the that it contained. I know in my family we were prevented from drinking milk for years as a result of that. This was the President John Kennedy decided to deliver the commencement address at American University in Washington. I'd like to read you a bit of what he said. Some say that it's useless to speak of world peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help that we must re-examine our own attitude as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs, And every graduate of this school, citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace, should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, toward the Soviet Union, toward the course of the Cold War, and toward freedom and peace here at home. First, let us examine our attitude toward peace itself. Too many of us think that it's impossible. Too many think it unreal. But that is a dangerous defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. Kennedy went on to urge focusing on a more practical, more attainable peace based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interest of all concerned. Genuine peace, he said, must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. Kennedy then suggested re-examining our attitude toward the Soviet Union, seeing beneath its propaganda and remembering that, quote, no government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, and in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered in the course of the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives then. Countless millions of homes and farms were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including nearly 2/3 of its industrial base, were turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the devastation of this country east of Chicago. End quote. Now, no American president during the Cold War had ever expressed such appreciation of Soviet achievements and concern for Soviet suffering in war. The Soviet government was so pleased that it reprinted the speech in full in its major newspapers and allowed its broadcasts throughout the Soviet Union, something that had never happened before in history to an American president. But Kennedy wasn't finished. Noting that the two countries bear the biggest arms burden and run the greatest risks from nuclear devastation, he asserted, quote, we are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle in which suspicion on one side breeds suspicion on the other, and new weapons beget counterweapons. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct our attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot now end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal, end quote. He then recommended a new analysis of the Cold War, asserting that, quote, we are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. We must deal with the world as it is and not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace in the hopes that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communists' interest to agree on a genuine peace. We can seek a relaxation of tensions without relaxing our guard. And finally, he announced, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on the matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve it, end quote. 5 days later, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, gave a speech in which he welcomed Kennedy's speech and announced that the Soviets were suspending the production of strategic bombers, bombers that could reach the United States from the Soviet Union and return home safely. And 5 days thereafter, the Soviets announced both their agreement to establish a direct telegraphic connection between the two governments so they could communicate instantly to lessen the likelihood of war by accident or miscalculation, and the suspension of Soviet atmospheric nuclear tests. Negotiations on a formal atmospheric nuclear test ban treaty between the two countries, plus Great Britain, then the only other nuclear power, began in July, and the treaty was signed on August 5th. Then, on September 15th, the Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, proposed that the member states of the two major alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, sign a non-aggression pact and a German peace treaty. There had never been a treaty ending World War II. Nothing came of that, but 5 days later, President Kennedy, speaking before the United Nations, proposed joint US-Soviet space exploration. 4 days later, the US Senate ratified the test ban treaty, and it went into force on October 10th. Meanwhile, the American media were reporting that American policymakers were considering proposals for stationing observers from both nations in areas along the Central Front where the danger of surprise attack was greatest, along with expansion of the nuclear test ban to cover underground testing as well as atmospheric testing. And also under consideration, according to these reports, we're establishing the first direct flights between New York City and Moscow and opening a US consulate in Leningrad and a Soviet consulate in Chicago. On October 9th, President Kennedy approved a massive sale of US wheat to the Soviet Union to compensate for a bad Soviet harvest. And on October 19th, a United Nations resolution jointly supported by the US and the Soviet Union banning orbital bombs in space, something Gromyko had proposed a month earlier and Kennedy had publicly agreed to. That month, the two countries also exchanged prisoners who had been convicted of espionage and imprisoned. The pace of tension relaxation had been intensifying ever since Kennedy's Strategy for Peace commencement address, as it was called, and reports indicated that some in the Pentagon and some US allies governments, especially West Germany, were increasingly fearful that a peace race might break out, replacing the long-standing Cold War arms race. As a result, the initiatives were suspended in what some called a pause in the thaw. And then, on November 22nd, President Kennedy was assassinated. And that brought an end to what scholars now call the Kennedy experiment. I mention this example in detail because it manifests two important innovations. First of all, putting ourselves in the shoes of the brains of our adversaries. And secondly, undertaking a unilateral initiative, in this case the suspension of atmospheric nuclear testing, designed to induce reciprocation by the other side. And as you can see, what it actually did create was an ongoing process of reciprocation in which each side met the suggestions of the other and then raised the ante, in effect, encouraging the other to go even further in the direction of a more stable peace. Both of these things, putting yourselves in the shoes of the adversary and undertaking unilateral reciprocation-inducing initiatives, were contrary to the conventional wisdom of the time. Most people at that time considered the world to be anarchic, lacking any kind of governance or even agreement about ways of limiting conflict. And most people consider our adversary as intransigent and unchangeable, and therefore an entity that could only be deterred from doing terrible things to us by our threatening to do even more terrible things to them. Also, the conventional wisdom held that military force was the only effective means to protect, defend, and perhaps change the world. This view, this conventional wisdom, which unfortunately is all too common even today, so long after that Kennedy experiment, this view is based on an unquestioned assumption. The assumption that reality is somehow given, out there, independent of us, independent of the thoughts we have about it and the way we act on the basis of our thoughts or assumptions. And this view holds, given all that, the best we can do is to figure out what that reality is as best we can, and then do the best we can in what we admit is a bad situation. This view, which is clearly still characteristic of the way most people think about international relations, is also quite characteristic of the way lots of people in our country and elsewhere think about other people in their own country, in their own communities, sometimes even in their own families. So this view comes from social theorists call this view reification, turning into a thing, something that's really a product of ongoing social relations. And this view comes in large part from the way politicians, pundits, and professors talk about reality, whether it's the reality of international relations or the reality of group relations or the reality of political party relations, or take your pick. Or actually, it's all of them, of course. And it comes in part from the fact that most people have a rather common education. They are being taught by professors who believe this stuff and reading books by people who believe this stuff and finding very little alternative perspectives in most cases that might broaden their understanding, deepen their understanding. So social theorists call this process the social construction of reality. And they mean by that generally that as a result of our culture, our social experiences, we get images of reality in our minds, and then we live by them. We act on the basis of them, we share them with other people, we continue to believe them, we look for evidence that confirms them, we tend to dismiss any evidence that might seem to disconfirm them, and so we thereby perpetuate a reality that we think is unchangeable. My view is that this is completely wrong, that the primary cause of reality being the way it seems to be is not that it's out there independent of us and unchangeable, but rather that we believe it to be out there independent of us and unchangeable, and so we act in accordance with that fundamental belief and thereby perpetuate or maintain a reality that we all know is terrible. So, what we need now is what, in social theory terms, we would call de-reification of reality. Turning our view of reality against our view of reality so that we no longer believe it to be out there independent of us, unchangeable, but instead come to understand that it's a product of the beliefs we hold and assume and share with each other about reality being independent of us and unchangeable. The problem is, there are several problems, but a major problem is that we do not yet have well enough developed theories of how the world works, how society works, how even family situations work, to be able to be confident of the extent to which what we experience as reality is in fact a product of these assumptions about it the way it is, and about how we might go about changing reality by changing the assumptions that we hold and that we operate on. So since, in effect, we don't know how much of reality is, as I'm suggesting, a product of the beliefs we hold and act upon about that reality. What this means then is that we have to become experimenters. We have to become experimenters in just the way President Kennedy was in the Kennedy experiment, by testing, by beginning with assumptions that are contrary to what people believe, but that are more potentially constructive of a better way of viewing things and a better way of encouraging constructive social change. We adopt assumptions that we cannot justify on the basis of the historical record, because the historical record is a product of this reification, and we test them by developing little ways of doing things that most experts would say we shouldn't do because we're going to get taken advantage of or whatever. And we see whether it works, whether acting in accordance with belief, acting as if it were true, actually elicits constructive responses from our world adversaries or our social group adversaries or our intrafamilial adversaries, whoever it happens to be. And if indeed that sort of experimentation does elicit a constructive response, then we do some more of it. If it doesn't, then we change what we're doing and try some other way of trying to break the stalemate and generate a more constructive reality. The way social theorists talk about this is to say we must learn to be reflective practitioners. This is a term that derives from the late social theorist at MIT, Donald Schoen, who studied professionals in a wide range of walks of life, as we say, everybody from nurses to city planners. And he found that in none of these fields do we have good enough theory to tell us just what we should do and be successful at. So everybody, practically speaking, has to improvise. You have to act before you know and learn while and by doing. You become a reflective practitioner. So that's basically what Kennedy did and Khrushchev, in partnership really, created by Kennedy's initiative. It's also, in a somewhat different way, the way in which Gorbachev and Reagan brought about the end of the Cold War. You can find the same kind of thing happening in a good many different situations around the world and in American politics even. I think it's the best way to understand the Sanders campaign and how successful it was, given the fact that everybody thought it was pretty much impossible to get anywhere. It probably has something to do with the success of the Trump campaign so far, although in his case it's a little harder to know just what the objective originally was and even what it is today, perhaps. It's also a good way of understanding why Sanders lost. He lost because he was defeated basically by the Democratic establishment, which was a reificatory entity, basically, doing exactly what we shouldn't be doing, making assumptions about the unchangeability of reality, in this case the political reality, and clinging desperately to those assumptions in the face of even evidence that seemed to suggest there was more potentially going on. So there are, I think, good reasons to think that there's more prospect for this kind of constructive action today than there has been in previous times. There are 6 areas in which I think there are major changes in global reality now that are very promising. I don't have time to talk about any of them in detail, but let me just list them for you quickly. Traditional national power politics is being displaced by transnationalizing politics characterized as much by influence as by power. National power economics is being replaced by globalizing capitalist economics with increasing elements of post-capitalist reforms. Expanding technologies are becoming exponentially exploding technologies, and all we have to do is think of our cell phones and the internet, and all which 20 years, 25 years ago didn't exist, and now have astonishing capabilities and are employed in a lot of political action. Localized cultures are being transformed into interpenetrating cultures. The largely unconscious ecological impacts of human activity are giving way to emerging ecological consciousness on the part of large growing elements of every society. And finally, and particularly interesting in a setting like this, mediated spiritual experience. That is where you have a spiritual authority, a priest or a imam or whoever, basically telling you what to believe, what the truth is about spiritual reality, how to live your life, and how much you depend on him or her as the person to tell you what to do. That is being transformed by increasingly worldly religious manifestations, not only political activism in the major world religions and explicitly religious capitalist economic activity, but also, and I think in a way in the long run much more promising and interesting, growing worldwide movement seeking to restore the original emphasis in each of the great spiritual traditions on the direct experience of the divine, not mediated by priests and other authorities, but experienced directly by individuals. So that collection of changes in the context make me more optimistic about the future. The other thing is that I think very important, we've had recently much more study of the role of nonviolence in the world and in national situations. And there is overwhelming evidence that nonviolence is more effective than violence in engineering social change. And if you're interested in this, I recommend you take a look at a TED Talk by Erica Chenoweth, a professor at the University of Colorado, who has studied all 20th century instances of efforts to bring about social change, whether by violence or nonviolence, and finds the overwhelming advantage comes to nonviolent rather than violent strategy and tactics. It's a great TED Talk you can watch and learn a lot from just online. The case of Syria is a good illustration of this. After the Arab Spring emerged, Syrians who were opposed to the Assad regime debated for weeks and weeks whether to undertake nonviolence or whether to resort to violence, and we all know the outcome of that debate. So far, 400,000 slaughtered civilians and no prospect of being any closer to a peaceful resolution of any of the problems. So I could talk at great length about all this, but I do want to leave some time for questions. So let me just stop there and invite questions. Yes?
Thank you so much for your enlightening talk and inspiring talk. The last of the 6 issues that you discussed, I couldn't quite remember all the words you used there to describe it, but it was a global spirituality that you were referencing. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. This is, I think, perhaps best captured by the term the contemplative revolution. It originated in the current period in the discoveries of Father Thomas Keating, a Catholic priest, who went back to the experiences of the early church fathers and mothers and found that they were all basically contemplatives. There were not authoritative churches in the conventional sense that we think of them then. There were people who wandered around and talked with each other, encouraged each other to pray contemplatively. That basically means in silence, inviting inspiration from the divine. In other words, creating a direct relationship with the divine by individuals. As we know, over time, ambitious people intervened, created institutions that we still have, many of which are doing their best to prevent this kind of thing from spreading. But this movement, this contemplative movement, is popping up everywhere, not just in the Catholic Church, in the Protestant churches. We find it, of course, in Buddhism and other great spiritual traditions. And while there appear to be some differences among these things, the essence of them is the emphasis on the importance, the validity, the necessity of direct experience of the divine.
Yes, my name's Margaret Borden, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why, given the vast amount of evidence of the efficacy of nonviolence over violence, and I myself am familiar with a lot of groups that are working for peace in various conflicts around the world, having small successes, overwhelming evidence, with the evidence there, why is there a problem? What is keeping this evidence from being believed, or whatever the right word is here? I don't know if it's just a belief. Yes. What's your thoughts on that?
The basic answer to that is that the conventional views that I summarized still dominates most of the authorities and most of our institutions. And so here we are on 9/11. Now let's look back at what has happened over the last 15 years. When the United States was attacked, that's really a kind of an exaggeration of what happened, but when the attack on those particular targets occurred, our response was immediately to turn to violence to try to meet violence with violence, basically, and escalate it dramatically. Now, if you remember, there had been another attack on the World Trade Center in the parking garage some years earlier, and President Clinton had done the same thing. He resorted to violence. What he did was launch cruise missiles at the training camps in Afghanistan, and we know how effective that turned out to be. They just moved off, let the cruise missiles blow up some buildings, and then moved right back in and continued to do the same sort of training, and ultimately trained terrorists who continued to undertake activities like 9/11. So, and then when the United States responded to 9/11, what did we do? First, we invaded Afghanistan. The cruise missiles didn't do it, so let's invade and see if that'll work. And then we invaded Iraq on pretexts that were totally unfounded, the idea that Saddam Hussein was harboring terrorists and funding terrorists and engaging in hostile acts, none of which was, and had also had weapons of mass destruction, none of which has turned out to be true, and many people knew at the time it wasn't true. So that effort to deal with terrorism by the dramatic escalation and expansion of violence has produced even greater instability in a part of the world that was already extremely unstable, and has resulted in the development of ISIS today, and the pervasion of that movement in other countries, Libya, for example, and Syria, of course. So it's pretty clear that that approach has not worked very well. In fact, it's been catastrophic for world affairs, let alone the people of the countries where most of this activity has occurred. But you don't hear a whole lot of, we do hear now more people saying the Iraq invasion was a mistake, but you didn't hear much of that at the time, and we don't hear much about alternative approaches yet, even though people who study these things know that nonviolent approaches can be very powerful. And incidentally, much of that is a product of the work of one man, a guy named Gene Sharp, who over decades wrote a series of books on the use of nonviolence, starting with case studies of Gandhi in India and South Africa. And his books, which are available free on the internet, were the inspiration for the Arab Spring and the manuals back in the former Yugoslavia when the effort to overthrow the dictatorship and bring peace was underway. This work has had an enormous impact in particular places where it's been taken seriously. And if you're interested, take a look online, just Google Gene Sharp, S-H-A-R-P, and you can find books on how to use nonviolence effectively and lots of accounts. And there's also a very interesting hour-long documentary about him that's available online.
I hope this doesn't sound too trite, but do you suppose that Donald Trump may be using Kennedy's strategies to relate to Russia?
Well, I'd like to believe that in the absence of all the other things we know about Donald Trump. And I think it is possible that he thinks that he could negotiate better that he would begin with somewhat different assumptions and be more successful in negotiating with Putin and the Russians. And I think that's probably true if it's in the context, if it's understood the way I'm talking about it. But I don't see that he sees it that way, because he has very few specific proposals for foreign policy, but his big one is drastically increase our military. So I'm pessimistic about that.
I'm Patty Ryan. Do you have, are there any results on the efficacy of the Peace Corps in promoting peace in the countries where those volunteers have served? My son was in the Peace Corps recently.
I missed the first part of your question.
Do you know what the efficacy of the Peace Corps is in promoting peace in those countries where those volunteers have served?
Well, first of all, my brother was in the Peace Corps. I know lots and lots of people, lots of former students who've been in the Peace Corps. And I have no doubt that it has a very valuable, it's a very valuable experience for the people who do it. And it affects, in very positive ways, the lives directly impacted by the activities of the Peace Corps. And there are lots of other organizations, often church-related organizations, that do all kinds of things like this. Lots of foundations doing important work, bringing, for example, fresh water to people who don't have it, bringing medical treatment to them. All of those things are very important, wonderful. They don't, however, address the policy-making level at this point. And policymakers, I think, tend to view them as kind of luxuries or insignificant things when they're thinking about where should we put our governmental resources.
I've been your admirer since 45 years ago when I met you at graduate school, and I'm continuously impressed by your presentation today. I am wondering, I have two questions. One is about Sir Francis Bacon's idea of scientific revolution and his prerequisites to get scientific methodology, which was the notion of 4 idols one had to get rid of. I don't know why the universities don't have a curriculum to study that, because in order to be objective perceptor of reality, one has to understand what the internal prejudice of a person is. That's one. And the other is about the relationship between money and lack of peace. I think there is a huge flow of money into the lack of peace. I remember one time I saw a show. There were two opponents, one from the American side and one from the Russian side. We're talking about each other's maneuvers. So, and the question was, you know, how many people do you have in the defense establishment? They both said, you know, they said, you know, hundreds of thousands.
The relationship between money and peace.
Well, as far as Francis Bacon goes, I don't think you would find him figuring anywhere in, say, at UT in the curriculum. He would be considered dated and probably not relevant, but there are plenty of other people who are somewhat more contemporary and who could be helpful in that regard. On money and politics, there's no doubt that money plays a major role in policymaking at all levels. But I think there are also encouraging developments there. Again, they are low level and they're kind of not so visible to most people, but the emergence of co-ops, for example, in all sorts of aspects of the economic life and the social life of people around the world, not just in the United States. In fact, it's less common in the United States than many other countries. And I think we are beginning to see a better understanding of the role of money and more unhappiness about the role of money. And I think the growing attention to inequality is an important indicator of some of that, and is raising questions that point to the bad effects of inequality are not just that poor people are poor, but that rich people have so much power in so many aspects of life because they can buy whoever they want and whatever they want. So I think we have more growing understanding of the importance of things you're pointing to, and we have little signs here and there of efforts at developing alternative institutions. So once again, I'm more optimistic than many people are about that.
And once again, if you could introduce yourself and then keep your questions concise, please.
Martha Schumacher, I will be as concise as possible. I think we're on a path of war. Number one, Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex, and we did not listen. I don't think there has been any good or necessary war since World War II. Now, since you've taught a course on the Vietnam War, then my question is, would you elaborate a little bit and educate us about the Vietnam War? Why?
Well, the Vietnam War was undertaken basically because of a mistaken theory of international relations known as the domino theory, saying that if anybody, if any country should fall to the communist government, whatever that might mean, the neighbors would start to fall, and soon all of Asia would have become communist. We know that what there actually was a kind of a reverse domino effect. After we lost the Vietnam War and withdrew, Vietnam went capitalist, and its neighbors have been going capitalist too. Now, capitalism is not the solution to most of these problems, but it does point out that the danger was not that communism was not the threat that we were told it was, and we didn't need to do the sort of thing we did. We still live with the consequences of the Vietnam War. We still have lots of veterans suffering from Agent Orange and other effects, and we didn't understand PTSD as well then, and we didn't even have the term for it then. Now we know that was a major factor as well. So I think I would agree with you that none of these wars we've fought has ultimately been a good war, a constructive war, something that has really made the world a better place.
Okay. I just graduated from UT last year, and I have a question, someone going through their very first quarter life crisis. Basically, I'm wondering how to address those with more privilege than another, people in the government like Rick Perry or Greg Abbott or something, making policies against certain groups, but from the perspective of someone who may seem that they don't have any power. How do you do that?
Well, that's a really good question, and there's no easy answer to it. The question is how can people without power address people like Governor Abbott or Rick Perry or other people with political power, right? And I think the problem there is that these people all grew up believing just what I was talking about earlier as this reified view of reality, and even though they may not like it, they think there's no alternative to behaving the way they behave, and they get support for doing that because most of the rest of the population also believes that and keeps hearing that from the media and from most politicians. So this is a kind of an educational problem, I think, basically at its root, and we all can play a role in that educational change by questioning whenever anybody in our own sphere of interaction talks or speaks on the basis of assumptions of the sort I'm talking about as being misguided, questioning those and asking what the evidence for that is and whether it isn't more a product of people just assuming there's no alternative. And I don't know that we would ever convert Rick Perry or Greg Abbott, but they're not going to be around forever. There are a lot of other people more like you and more your age who are rapidly becoming more active, potentially anyway, in politics and in society and in the culture. And I think in a way it's all of our responsibilities to be educators in the way I'm talking about in all aspects of our lives with everybody, even if we aren't talking to governors and former governors and whatever.
We only have about 5 minutes left. 10 minutes, excuse me.
Hi, I'm Dale Beulah. First of all, if Kennedy were to make that speech today, I would assume several people would say he was weak and inexperienced or whatever. I'm sure he would be attacked for making that speech. But my concern has to do with climate refugees and the instability that can be caused by this massive migration of people whose lands are going to be underwater. This won't be from war, but it will be massive. I mean, we've seen the impacts on Europe. And when we talk about hundreds of millions of climate refugees in the next 10 or 15 years, that kind of instability, have you factored any of that into some of your models?
Well, you're certainly right that we already have climate refugees, and we're certainly going to have many more very quickly, I think, although experts disagree a little on how quick that process will be in particular regions and all. But I think the big problem there, the big obstacle at this point is that we now have a situation where large percentages of our politicians are now climate change deniers. That was not true 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Many of those people have changed their minds. I mean, take Mitt Romney, for example. He was a big advocate of dealing with climate change until he decided to run for president as a Republican and decided then he didn't believe in climate change. Well, that view is quite pervasive in mainly the Republican Party, but elsewhere too. And the encouraging thing there is that my students don't, even the most conservative of my students do not believe that. They are really worried, and rightly so. And I think the two areas where I saw the biggest generational difference among particularly conservative students with in relation to their parents, in effect, where it was climate or environment very generally, and human rights, particularly gay and lesbian, transgender, et cetera rights. My students, no matter what their political views, had no use for the kind of pelvic politics that their parents continue to engage in. And they think at best this is just a stupid thing to pay your attention to, and they disagree basically. So I think there is reason for some optimism of a sort of generational sort here. Once we start to see coastal areas getting submerged, I think even the climate deniers are going to have a lot more difficult time taking that position. But then we do have the question, well, what do we do with all these people? And the hostility to foreigners becomes the big obstacle there. And that also has gotten worse in recent years, and it's been fed by irresponsible politicians who ought to know better. It's so obvious that what has made the United States great has been the diversity and the immigrants, basically. I mean, we're all children of immigrants, pretty much, in the United States. But it is so obvious that that's what benefits all of us, including the people who campaign against immigrants, that I think, once again, there's an education that needs to be spread by all of us. Anytime we hear somebody, even a friend or somebody standing in line in the supermarket or whatever, bad-mouthing immigrants or ethnic or otherwise different people, we need to be more expressive of the way we see those circumstances than we often are. And I think public attitudes are changing among younger people and can change among older people too. That's the best I can do for you, though.
I'm curious because I'm very impressed with what you said about what were relations essentially among nation states. I think what we've seen happen in Iran recently is very promising for those nation states. We thought were going to be difficult. We might even have a chance with North Korea. But we're looking at these terrorist groups that are something other than nation states, that attract, because of our technology, people throughout the world for their cause, and also have the ability to use weaponry that was never as portable. So between the communications and the idea that now they're no longer nation states, how do we apply what you're suggesting?
Well, that's another fine question, Jim. It's certainly true that the situation is more complex now than it used to be, because we used to deal primarily with nation states, and now we have lots of non-state actors. But let's remember, most of the non-state actors are very constructive actors. They are non-governmental groups that are doing important work dealing with everything from climate to health to education to water, et cetera. And what is happening to the nation state is that it's losing power in two directions at once, to subnational groups and transnational groups at the lower level, but also to transnational organizations at the higher level. And you know, when an entity that has power sees its power being threatened, it tends to become defensive, and states are becoming defensive there. But a large part of the problem, of the terrorist problem, is a problem of education once again. And I think church leaders bear special responsibility here, and not all church leaders have been responsible in speaking out about varying contentions about what particular religions, especially in the moment, Islam in general believes, and what counts as Islamic theology and practical applications. I would like to hear a lot more from Islamic leaders about the real nature of Islamic teachings, which after all privileged innocent people over everything else, and the casualties of terrorist attacks are almost entirely innocent people. So I think some politicians have been making little efforts at this, and some religious leaders have been making efforts as well. We need a lot more of that, but and some of our policies have been very counterproductive. So, for example, the Saudi Arabian government has been funding madrasas around the world to teach where there's no public education, which is another problem, to teach little kids to be jihadists, and in their sense of the term, not the traditional sense of what the word jihad meant, and to hate the West and hate other countries. And so the Saudi government funds these things, and we fund the Saudi government by we and our allies anyway, buying their oil and supporting policies that are counterproductive to everybody, including ultimately the Saudi government. So there's a lot of responsibility to go around here. The Wahhabi sort of Islamic ideology is very pernicious and totally at odds with everything I've ever learned about Islam. But that's what's being taught with Saudi money around the world today. And I think things like that we need to pay attention to as well. Doesn't solve the problem, but these are aspects of it.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for a fine presentation, and thank you for your life work.
No. Thank you all for your attention and your fine questions.